Episode 15 with Jennifer Crumpton. Hey everybody, you're listening to the Never Forsaken podcast, looking at the lives of the outcasts, the seekers, the never forsakens, those in or out of the local church and passionate about Christ. The show is broadcast weekly, and show notes and more information can be found at neverforsakenpodcast.com. I'm your host, John Robinson. Let's get into the show. Hey friends, thanks for tuning in again to the Never Forsaken podcast. Just wanted to take a moment to talk about a few things. Number one, just wanted to remind everyone about a ministry that my friend Jerry Herships is doing called Christmas in the Park 2015. Jerry's out in Denver, Colorado, and he's doing a great work with the homeless out there. What they're doing for Christmas in the Park is looking for donations of sleeping bags. You can get these sleeping bags on walmart.com. I'm going to put a link up on the show site. And I think they're only like $24, $25. You can have them shipped over to where Jerry's ministry is. There's a church that's collecting them. And their goal is to give out 500 sleeping bags. Jerry's got people who promise to match sleeping bag donations, dollar for dollar, sleeping bag for sleeping bag. So he's got some great things going on. So just $25, you can buy a sleeping bag, send it out there, and bless somebody this Christmas season. Other thing I wanted to mention too is about 90% of the listeners are in the United States for the podcast, but the podcast has also been heard in over 50 countries outside the United States, in Israel, Korea, Australia, Mexico, France, Sweden, Brazil, China, Finland, Austria, Serbia, Ukraine, and on and on. I'm hoping that this podcast reaches some ears, that you would log on and interact on Facebook page, on Twitter, on neverforsakenpodcast.com. Despite the show having about 2,000 downloads or so just to get going, I'd love to hear some interaction among listeners. I'd love to hear where you're from. I'd like to hear your thoughts on the show, whether they be good or bad. I know I do have some controversial guests on here. Not everybody agrees with the opinions, and I would just like to hear from other people. So you can log on to neverforsakenpodcast.com. You can find us on Twitter, Never Forsaken, and also on Facebook, Never Forsaken Podcast. Thank you, podcast listeners, for tuning in to another episode of the Never Forsaken Podcast. My guest today is Jennifer Crumpton. Jennifer, welcome to the show.
Thanks, John. Thanks for having me.
Jennifer, I didn't introduce you with your titles and your jobs and what you do. Would you mind sharing a little bit with the listeners what it is exactly that you do?
Sure. I know it's a little confusing sometimes. So my winding journey has involved 15 years approximately in the corporate world. I was an advertising executive. I worked for Fortune 500 companies, and I always like to say that my last client, which was MasterCard,
wow,
really taught me what was priceless. And I went to seminary.
Oh, wow.
So
that's a commercial right there.
Right? I don't think it's a commercial they want, but
no.
Maybe it's a commercial for seminary. But
that would be pretty cool.
So I really took stock of my life. I loved working in advertising and business, but there was something about the whole thing with advertising is basically like you're convincing people that they have a hole in their soul that they can only fill with your product.
Okay.
And you're making a lot of money for big corporations. So I took stock of my life and decided, I'd really like to put my skills to work and my time and my energy and effort to work for something good. So I thought, if there was anything I could do, what would it be? And I had really been reading a lot of theology for the first time. I grew up a Christian, but you're not really fed, in some circumstances, real theology, Christian theology. And so I had started reading a lot of books, and I'd started reading about feminism, and which I had not been taught growing up either. And I decided, I'd really like to go to seminary and see what I can do to combine this career of storytelling, like creative writing and creative work. What could I do with faith? So I went to Union Theological Seminary. I got my Master of Divinity. I very unexpectedly got ordained in the Christian Church. Disciples of Christ is my denomination. And
well, let me ask you a question about that, and I'll let you continue. But
sure,
with ordination, that's not allowed in a lot of denominations.
Right. That's so true. And I was coming, I'm originally from Birmingham, Alabama. I grew up in the Southern Baptist tradition, very right-wing, conservative, evangelical. And so I had never seen a woman in leadership in the church at all. I moved to New York when I was 30 years old, and I started to see, I would visit churches where there was a little bit more involvement from women, but a lot of the church plants, even here in New York City, that have sort of more of an evangelical underpinning to them, if you will, that they might not explicitly say is there, they don't let women lead either. So when I went into seminary, I had no idea what I would do on the other side. I was like, I have no context for what a woman can do in this realm. I'm just going to go play with it. And Union is an extraordinary place. It's very ecumenical. It's very gender equality, LGBTQ equality. We talk about racial issues. We talk about interfaith, interreligious issues. So in 3 years, my little Southern Baptist girl that was still living inside of me as an adult got her mind blown.
Wow.
So I came out after 3 years, luckily at seminary, been afforded, close range to all these women who had gone on and got ordained, who were leading the seminary. When I came in at Union in 2008, the first woman to ever be president of the seminary had just come in. So I was really coming in at a really interesting time, and I chose the Christian Church Disciples of Christ to do my internship at a church here in New York City called Park Avenue Christian Church because 2 or 3 women who are in very high-ranking academic and leadership positions, including the president, Serene Jones, were ordained disciples of Christ. So, I saw a glimmer of hope here, but I sort of went into seminary thinking I would never come out being ordained. I would just be I would come up with something else, that I would somehow do with this.
Right.
And so, in a sense, what I've done is sort of create an amalgamation of those things. I was ordained, and I do things with my church, Park Avenue Christian Church. But I also am very interested in the online space and where young people who are grappling with their religious backgrounds and their spirituality, particularly women, where they are. And in my career, I kept a little bit of that business, advertising, storytelling aspect to it. In that media commentating, you'll see me on, several different networks. I'll do a lot of social commentary about what's happening with women in the world, with politics, with the election cycle, with legislation. And I'm a writer and a columnist. I write for Huffington Post and for Patheos about women, faith, and politics. I basically, have made this bizarre career out of talking about all the things you're not supposed to talk about at the dinner table.
Yeah, which is kind of the opposite of like growing up evangelical, things you mentioned. And
my thought was that, women are becoming very independent. Women have made great strides just over the past few decades. And sometimes when you look back at it, it hasn't been very long that women have even been in the workplace, So, women are making their own money. They are secure. They're leading their own lives as a leader of their household. And there are so many different reasons now why women would decide to have a child, proactively decide. I want to have a child, and I'm ready to do so, and I'm going to do it on my own. Maybe it's because they haven't found the right partner, or because they waited, they've tried to build a career, so they've, maybe waited until they're a little bit older, and now they want to, have a baby on their own, or, sometimes partners are together, and They're very committed to one another, but marriage just isn't something they're interested in. And those people make just as great parents as anybody else does. You can be in a marriage where your you can be a child born into a marriage between a man and a woman and have a horrific experience, I think women are starting to take control of their lives. They're not waiting for men or for marriage anymore to fulfill what is the family for them, and they make amazing parents.
So along these lines now you get, and this is not a debate show, so I'm not I'm not debating you at all. I'm just throwing things out there that I read. I like to spark the discussions with people and just get people to think. But so along these lines, you're talking about, okay, well now women are more independent. Women kind of want to do their own thing, and there's a big keyword that you probably hear this a lot, is Jezebel. It's like Jezebel spirit, independent spirit. If you encounter that, how do you deal with that, and saying that, a woman can stand on her own and do her own thing and not have to depend on a man?
Right. It's funny, John, because I rescued a cat 10 years ago, and I named her Jezebel. And, part of it is because the name just fit her. But the other part is...
Well, nobody names a daughter
right,
that, right?
Nobody probably names their daughter that. I would love to meet someone who did, though, because I really think that would be a bold and courageous move. If you look back at it, though, the biblical character this concept is derived from is doing nothing different than any of the male leaders, who are exploiting their position of power. And I think, first of all, it's really unfair that there's this whole history over the centuries of coming up with concepts to suppress and shame women. A lot of it comes from the Bible, and a lot of it comes from the fear of the female having any power, even if it's just over herself. There's this long history that's attached to that idea of the Jezebel and the fear of that person having any power. So, I think that this, is a lingering sort of concept, but I think it's quickly being pushed to the side, and I think it's a little bit generational as well. Older generations may have a harder time understanding that women are just like men. I mean, there may be some differences, but we're just human beings, and we're just trying to live our most fulfilling lives and fulfill our purpose and build our families and successfully use our brains, just like any man is. So I really think, especially, with younger generations, especially the millennials, and I'm right there on the cusp, but I'm Generation X. I look at these young women coming up. I'm like, yes, this is awesome, because these young women are just not taking it. They're not even responding. If somebody called them a Jezebel because they were, on their own career path and independent and making decisions as the leader that they are, they would just laugh it off. So I think we'll start to see a major shift in society around that concept.
Well, that's what I was going to ask you about this generation now. I'm glad you brought that up, because do you see that this generation now, and I'm kind of Generation X myself, and I feel more like a millennial, though, I guess. I'm in my 40s, but I don't feel it. I don't know. I think I relate better to those in their 20s. But, so my conversation with a lot of with millennials is that for them, it's like the gospel has changed. And I don't want to say that. It's hard to say this, but like, I don't think that the gospel has changed, but has the perception changed? Because I don't think that Jesus' words really change, although some things are, say, set for that time and for certain circumstances. But so how do we look at this? Like, is the gospel really changing? Have we been duped all along? And maybe have we been told, a patriarchal lie?
Yeah, I think you just said it very well. I think there is a patriarchal lie in the Bible. There's several of them. And, in my book, Femmevangelical, The Modern Girl's Guide to the Good News, one of the things I do, because I want young women to be able to look at the gospel and see where it's empowering, we kind of have to start from the point of breaking it down. What have you been taught growing up as a Christian about the Bible, about doctrine, and about hierarchy and your place in it? And, when it comes to Scripture, I was obviously raised a literalist, that every word was God-inspired and true, meaning that it actually happened exactly the way it says it is. And then, when I went to seminary, when you actually really study the Bible, like really study it as a document and where it came from and, all the piece parts and where they came from and what was happening when those things were written and who wrote them and what their place in the power structure was and what they were trying to do or who they were trying to overturn or, it's a very political book and it reflects the times, as you said. And it's also interesting to me, one thing that I try to let young women know is, Jesus did his thing, his very radical thing when he stood in the temple in first century, now Palestine, in a tiny little temple and said, it read from the scroll of Isaiah, basically, or didn't read. He probably had it memorized because he was a Jew. And he stood up and said, the Spirit of the Lord is on me. I'm here to release the prisoners. I'm here to restore sight to the blind. And, basically here to turn everything on its head. What was happening at the time was his people were being oppressed by the Roman Empire. And he got crucified basically under the Roman Empire because he was making such a ruckus about the poor and the destitute and the people who didn't fit in and couldn't pay Caesar and wouldn't be loyal to Caesar. So he gets crucified. It's a couple decades before the first gospel sort of comes out. There's all different sorts of Jesus movements floating around in Roman occupied territory. Hundreds of years later, basically, the Roman Empire claims that story. So, of course, as we all know, Constantine, was the one who decided to let up on the Christians and stop slaughtering them and all that kind of good stuff. So the Roman Empire, through Constantine and through several of his, successors, they basically claimed Christianity for themselves. They're the ones who developed Christianity. It wasn't Jesus. So, they basically flipped everything to make it seem like the Roman Empire was this holy kingdom, all of the imagery of Jesus that is in the Bible. And you think about the Roman Empire putting together the New Testament. They're the ones who did it. So none of this comes from Jesus himself. Jesus' story was written by people who had maybe witnessed some of it and some people who didn't witness any of it. So, I do think we've been blinded by this patriarchal Roman Empire, this book that so many Christians take literally, that they don't know anything about how it was formed or any of the political motivations, or how the Roman Empire, almost ended up taking credit for crucifying Jesus so that he could be resurrected and then become, And so I think we really have to readjust how we look at the gospel. I don't think the gospel of Jesus has changed. I think what we're starting to realize is all the nuances of centuries. People aren't blind anymore. It's like before there was the printing press, and the good Catholics would just go to church and they wouldn't even be able to understand half of what the priest said. And then they would pay all these penances and stuff and they would just be taken advantage of. And they could basically tell them anything. And they would believe it and they would do it. But now...
Right, people didn't read and whatnot.
Right, and it's almost been the same...
Or study on their own.
Yeah, even up through just recent decades. people have just believed whatever they heard in the pulpit, and they might read, excerpts of the Bible, or they might read a book here or a book there, but they don't know what the background of it really is. And I think people have started to say, no, I'm going to look into this for myself. I'm going to try to whittle down to what Jesus actually said. And I know that even in the Bible, where the letters are read, doesn't mean he actually even said those things. And what was the cultural context in which he was saying those things? And really trying to get back to the actual spirit of that zealot Jesus who did a lot of really crazy stuff in his time, and then starting to follow that person as opposed to this Romanized deity.
Well, that's interesting you say that about, reading, studying on your own. And here's kind of my short version of growing up in evangelical church and kind of just being in some ways told everything what to believe. This is how this is, and it's ABC, and it's XYZ, and I'm being very curious, and I'm by no means unique in this way, but I'm a studier, and I love to get into the scripture, and I don't generally take somebody's word for something. So, I would read and ask questions and study and say, okay, well, you're preaching this to me, but what about this? And I would ask a question, which led to another question, which led to another question, and then here's the big line I would get a lot. Well, basically, you just need to submit.
Right.
So here comes the big S word, submission. And even as I'm a man being told that, but I know even more so for women, it's this, I'm sure encountered this concept and this word of submission and biblical submission. But what's the reality of that? It seems it's like, here's your blog post is Femmevangelical for women who don't submit.
Yep.
And that must scream at some people.
Yeah. Yeah, John, it really does. It fires people up. And it fires women up in particular, because there's a whole contingent of women who still believe in submission. And I've been on both sides. I grew up, nobody ever told me outright growing up or as a teenager or when I started dating, you must submit to the man you're dating or to the man you marry. It wasn't said in those very explicit terms. It was done in an even worse way, which is just being woven so tightly and into your everyday life of what you see happening in your family, what you see happening around you in your community, the messages that you sort of pick up on. It's so subtle. And that makes it so much more dangerous, because you don't even realize that you're being taught to submit and that you are submitting. So it's funny, I sort of left evangelicalism after college. I started sort of experimenting and, totally did not buy into any of the submission stuff, although I didn't think about it in those explicit terms. And then somewhere around age 30 or so, this is before I went to seminary, I got involved in New York City with this group of artists that have a very evangelical sort of underpinning, and they get together once a week or once a month or something, and they do worship and they do all this stuff. And I got really involved in this group, which was very helpful because I had just moved to New York City. And there was echoes of that subtle, there were tons of career women there. There were tons of, women who were doing great things and single women, but somehow in all of the Bible study and the discussion, there was still this weird, subtle thread about that. And I started dating somebody that I met there. And I remember suddenly thinking that I understood the whole principle of submission and how it really freed people, to be in their roles, and it really freed people to trust each other in a relationship, and, that as they always point out that, well, the man is supposed to love the woman like Jesus loved the church and lay down his life for her and all this kind of stuff, which of course very rarely happens among humans.
Yeah, you don't see that. You hear it preached but not lived out.
Exactly. So women suffer under that. But for a fleeting moment, I thought I could see how evangelical women defended this whole submission thing. Because I thought I had met this man who was so godly, and he was a really nice guy. I'm not saying anything negative about him, but I thought, I've met this man who's so godly, such a good Christian, and so trustworthy, that in a sense I can understand this whole submission thing and why so many evangelical women swear by it. And then later, and not because of anything he did, but, later we broke up and, I moved on, and I looked back at that and I thought, wow, it's so slyly seductive, this concept that they try to teach you about, and it never works out well. And in Genesis, there's two different stories of creation, and a lot of people don't realize that, but in chapter 1 and chapter 2, there's two very different stories of creation. In one of them, it said that God made the man first, and then the female was made out of him. And a lot of women romanticize that whole thing, which leads to the whole submission principle. And then, God puts the man in charge of everything. Then there's a whole other story that's repeated, but this one says, we made them in our image, and we made them male and female. And it's so basic and it's so equal. I really think that this is one of those things in patriarchal times, especially at the point in time when women were able to start getting educated. And I'm thinking like way back in, the 3rd century, 4th century or something, when, women started becoming nuns and going into convents and withholding from sex, basically, so that they could get an education instead of become the wife of a man. I think, that really became something that people started pulling out of the Bible. But it's so unhealthy, and it's a power play. It's a patriarchal power play. Women should never be told to submit, not only because it leads to so much abuse, but also, I'll just say it again, we're human, we're just human beings, and we're no different.
Well, do we see a big difference then between a Christian feminist and, say like a non-Christian feminist? Because here's my stereotype growing up, and even through my 20s and most of my 30s, is these really radical, quote unquote, and please don't hold me to this, but feminazis, the short haircut, you know what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
And I know I'm stereotyping up, but I'm only doing it to make a point. But, this like feminazi, hates men, don't need men, want to take our guns away. And, how does this contrast with true Christian feminism?
Well, I think we need all of it. I think the first thing we have to do is step back for a moment and understand why some women are extremely angry. It's because they've really realized the toll that patriarchalism and sexism and misogyny have taken on their gender. When we look at how many, the number of women that are killed by gun violence from their intimate partner is staggering. Right. It's staggering how the domestic violence numbers, the rape numbers, it's like 1 in 4. 1 in 4 women in our country that we call the land of the free gets raped in her lifetime. So it is angering, and we should be angry, but yet we know we have to contain that anger, or else people will label us with the feminazi label. And I grew up with that too. I grew up being told feminists were horrible people, that they were,
sure.
Whining about nothing and, they were all crazy. And so feminism was something I really had to ease into through my late 20s and early 30s. And then once I started putting it all together, I was like, oh my gosh, we need feminism. I mean, we need feminism in so many ways. And feminism is something that Jesus, it's so compatible with the gospel. And that's what my book, Femmevangelical, is about, is that it basically is the gospel. When you boil it down and you look at Jesus standing up and saying, you know, I'm about to deliver you out of prison. I'm about to restore sight to all the blind, to the blindness of society, and to the corrupt leaders, and to the oppressive regimes and systems and that keep people from being able to live out their purpose and to be everything that God created them to be. I mean, that was Jesus' gospel. And, you know, he said it a little differently, and his fight was different in his time because it was for the Jewish people under Roman rule. But if you go back to the very heart of it, it's the same thing. And that's all women are trying to do with feminism. And we need the help of men. That's the thing, is we can't just do it by ourselves. We need men who love us and understand us and love us in the way, not the way Donald Trump says he loves women, because I have a feeling that's a little different.
Yeah.
But love in the way that Jesus loved, which was Jesus wanted to give people freedom and wholeness and equality in his society. And so, you know, we need that kind of love.
Well, and you know, Jesus was really scandalous in his relations with women as well. And I don't mean his relations, but I'm saying the way that he that needs to be rephrased, but you know what I mean? It's like he is, you know, first people that he appears to after resurrection, women. You've got the women at the well, and you know, so it's those stories probably wouldn't have been told for, you know, if not for a reason,
right?
Because it was, you know, women just had a different place in that society at that time.
Yeah, he was super scandalous. You're absolutely right about that.
So you kind of answered a little bit. I was going to just kind of wrap it up with, what are, you know, you said that women need men to kind of bring about change and all of this, and we all work together on it. So, Jennifer, what are some practical tips and ways in which we can do that, to kind of wrap things up with?
Oh, that's such a good question. I hope I can do it some justice. It's so important. And, you know, my husband, I've been married for a year and a half, and we dated for maybe 3 years before that. And when I first met him, I was just graduating from seminary. And I was this gospel-wielding feminist theologian and pastor, Christian pastor. And my husband is a Jewish lawyer. And
right.
I would say all this stuff, and, you know, I had repelled a lot of guys before dating them because they just didn't understand anything I ever said. And Dave just listened to me. He just listened to me, and non-judgmentally, and he tried to be really empathetic, understand where I was coming from when I would talk about the work I was doing or the papers or the blogs I was writing. And even though he was so, like, he had never heard most of these concepts before and had never really been exposed that much to feminism either, even though he had grown up in New York. And he really listened. He, you know, some of the things he does now is when he hears politicians on TV, you know, talking about women and, oh, you know, equal pay, that's just a bunch of crap, you know, or, you know, the government should be able to run women's bodies and make their health care decisions. He notices it now. He hears it. I think the first thing is just a recognition. Okay, how do we attune our ears to start hearing the stuff that women are hearing every 5 minutes of their day as they go about their lives,
right,
that make them feel terrible about themselves and that make them feel like they don't have any control over their own destiny? how can I start to hear those things too? How can I pick up on them and recognize them for what they are? And then how can I say stuff in my group, in my sphere of influence, in my group of guys, which can be really hard, because with guys, they get to, it's the same with women. We just do it maybe a little differently, but there's that thing, you get together and the guys are all talking about, so-and-so's boobs and, oh, look at her ass and, oh, look at, and talking about women in a certain way and, whatever. And so to be able to actually get to the point where you can speak up in your sphere of influence, whether it's at work, in business, or whether it's socially, and say, man, it's just really not cool to talk about women that way. Or to say, oh, I noticed that so-and-so in our office who does an amazing job, I know because she reports to me that she gets paid less than other people, or that she hasn't gotten a promotion, when she deserves one, but the men who are her peers have. Things like that, for guys to just start recognizing them and then having the courage to speak up about them. Wow, this world could really be a different place.
I agree. Like I said, it's been changing my mindset a lot, and it isn't easy. It's hard to come from your whole life of seeing things a certain way and through a certain perspective, and then slowly your perspective starts to shift and you start speaking differently, and it's like, wow, what's going on, man? I thought you were I thought you were a Christian. And I'm like, I am a Christian. This is like stuff that Christians should be talking about. It's the same in the political arena. I don't want to get in a lot of politics, but, speaking about certain things, then you get, I think a lot of people on one side become one or two topic. Christians get focused on one or two topics. Let's say that. Yeah. In politics. And I think it's a lot more, we've got to look at a lot bigger picture than one or two things and really start to address oppressed groups.
Yeah. Well, I think what your podcast is fantastic, and it's one of those things that can help make a lot of change too. And, it's not just hard for guys. It can be really hard for women too, because we're patriarchalized also. So, don't hold too much weight on yourself, because it's tough for women too. I went through it, having to come around to a new way of seeing the whole world, and it is really tough.
Well, Jennifer, your book is called what again?
Femmevangelical: The Modern Girl's Guide to the Good News.
Okay, and are you, correct me if I'm wrong, are you working on another book now?
I am starting. I'm in the process of dreaming up the next one.
Okay. I wasn't sure if there was one about to come out or not. And what's the best way for people to follow you through social media to get more information about the topics that we talked about?
The website is called femmevangelical.com. That's Femmevangelical, Femmevangelical.com. Or you can follow me on Twitter at Jenny D. Crumpton. That's Jenny with an I.
That sounds great, Jennifer. I'll also put all those links up on neverforsakenpodcast.com when we get you up on the website.
Awesome.
Jennifer, thank you so much for coming on the show today. I greatly appreciate it. Great having you here and to shed some more light on this topic.
Thanks, John, and thank you for what you're doing.